The train platform was crowded with strangers, the steam of the engine curling like ghosts in the early evening air. She stood there alone, her lace veil crumpled between trembling hands, her suitcase at her feet, and her eyes swollen red from hours of tears. People walked by her as though she was invisible, some glancing once and then turning away, others whispering behind gloved hands. Her dress, white and fragile as hope itself, was already smudged with soot and dust, the hem torn from where it dragged across the rough wooden planks. She had been promised a man, a husband waiting on the other side of the journey. A letter had come months ago, words of security and kindness written in a hand she could barely read but trusted enough to believe. Her parents had pushed her onto the train with prayers and warnings, telling her this was her chance to start anew, to be wanted. But as the train screeched to a halt at the lonely prairie station, no one stepped forward to claim her. She searched every face, strangers with hats pulled low, women gathering children, cowboys hauling supplies, but not the man she had been told would be there. She stood longer than she should have, her heart beating with the slow ache of betrayal, until the sting of realization broke her chest. He wasn't coming. The letter had lied, or maybe the promise had been a cruel joke. The others who had disembarked trickled away, and soon the station grew quiet, the only sound her muffled sobs carried into the dusk. She pressed her face into her hands, trembling, ashamed of being left like unwanted freight. From a distance, two figures watched. A rancher with weathered lines etched deep into his face leaned against the post, his eyes fixed not on her beauty or her dress but on her despair. At his side, a small boy clutched his hand, eyes wide as he studied the woman no one wanted. The boy's mother had been gone for years, buried under a cottonwood tree that bent with the weight of the wind. He had grown up without lullabies, without the softness of a mother's hands, and though his father did his best, there were nights he cried quietly into his pillow, asking why she had to leave. Now, looking at the trembling bride, something stirred inside him. He tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing with a small but certain hand. His voice cut through the evening like a fragile bell. "That's my mama." The rancher looked down at his son, startled. "Son," he began, but the boy's gaze was fixed, unwavering, as if he saw something no one else could. The rancher turned back to the woman, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of shame and loneliness. He could have ignored her like the others, could have taken his son's words as nothing more than childish longing, but instead, he took a step forward. The sound of boots against wood made her flinch. She looked up, eyes glistening, startled to see a tall man with the hard sun in his skin and a boy with hopeful eyes beside him. The man stopped a few feet away, removing his hat with quiet respect. "You're alone," he said softly, not as a question but a truth. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "He didn't come," she whispered, and the words broke her again. The boy let go of his father's hand and walked right up to her. He didn't hesitate. He touched her dress, the way children test the reality of something fragile and beautiful, and then slipped his small hand into hers. "You're my mama," he said again, this time with conviction, as though he had been waiting for her all along. Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not her own parents, who saw her as a burden, not the man who lured her across the miles with false promises. She stared at the boy, stunned by the innocence of his words, and then her gaze lifted to the rancher. He looked torn, caught between doubt and a kind of dawning wonder. "She ain't yours, son," the man said gruffly, though his voice cracked. Yet even as he said it, he couldn't bring himself to pull the boy away. Something about the way she held the child's hand, the way her trembling steadied under his touch, struck him deeper than he cared to admit. The station master coughed from the doorway, ready to close up for the night. The woman had no place to go. The prairie was vast and merciless, and she would be swallowed whole if she wandered alone. The rancher looked at her again, this woman who had been promised and abandoned, who looked like she had nothing left but the torn lace on her shoulders. He could walk away and leave her fate to the wind, but the boy's words clung to him like a prayer. He adjusted his hat, cleared his throat, and spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentler this time, "you got nowhere tonight. You'll come with us. Until you find where you're meant to be." Her lips parted, stunned. She wanted to refuse, to hide in her shame, but the boy's hand in hers anchored her. She nodded once, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The rancher bent to pick up her battered suitcase, his calloused hand wrapping around the worn leather as though it weighed nothing at all. He didn't look at her when he carried it toward the wagon, didn't press her with questions, but his silence carried something steadier than promises. She followed, clutching the boy's hand, and for the first time since she stepped off the train, her heart didn't feel like it would break entirely. The boy smiled up at her, a smile filled with certainty, and whispered again, as if the truth lived only on his lips, "Mama." The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled across the dirt road leading away from the station. The night had stretched its long arms across the prairie, swallowing the horizon in shadows and starlight. The bride sat on the wooden bench of the wagon, her white dress tucked beneath her, the veil folded in her lap, her suitcase at her feet. Beside her, the boy leaned against her arm, his head resting with the natural trust of a child who already believed she belonged. She wasn't sure if she should speak. The silence between her and the rancher was thick, but not unkind. He held the reins with steady hands, eyes fixed on the long trail home. The occasional crack of leather and the snort of the horses filled the night. She studied him quietly, his broad shoulders, his worn shirt, the way his jaw clenched like a man carrying more than he ever said. The boy stirred, his small voice breaking the quiet. "Papa, is Mama coming home with us forever?" The rancher's hands tightened on the reins. He glanced at her briefly, then back at the dark road. "That's not for me to say, son. That's for her." Her heart thudded painfully. She hadn't been given a choice in so long. Her parents had decided her fate, the letter had lured her across miles, and the silence of the empty platform had decided her worth. The idea that her choice mattered now, in this wagon with strangers, was something she didn't know how to hold. The boy yawned, curling closer against her. His warmth seeped into her bones, quieting some of her trembling. She reached down and smoothed his hair, and the simple act felt like remembering something she had never been taught but always known. When the ranch came into view, the lanterns glowing faint against the dark outline of the barn and the old wooden house, she felt the ache of unfamiliarity. This was not her home. She was a stranger carried into someone else's life. Yet when the boy clasped her hand tighter, she didn't pull away. The rancher helped her down from the wagon, his touch careful, respectful. He carried her suitcase inside without a word, setting it gently by the doorway of the modest home. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather, of a place lived in by men in silence. The walls bore the absence of softness, a missing woman's hand in every corner. He lit a lamp, the glow chasing shadows into corners. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but you'll have a roof tonight. You can take the spare room." She nodded, unsure if she should thank him, unsure if her voice would even hold if she tried. The boy, however, had no such hesitation. He tugged her hand, pulling her toward the stairs with childish insistence. "You sleep next to me, Mama. I don't want you far away." Her throat tightened at his words. She looked helplessly at the rancher, who rubbed the back of his neck, clearly torn. "Son, let the lady be. She needs rest, not." But the boy's stubbornness won. His wide eyes, filled with hope, turned back to her. "Please." She couldn't deny him. Not tonight, when his certainty was the only anchor holding her in place. She smiled faintly, though it wobbled with emotion, and nodded. The boy grinned, tugging her up the stairs. The room was simple, just a bed, a dresser, a small wooden cross on the wall. The boy crawled onto the bed and patted the space beside him, waiting. She hesitated, still in her crumpled wedding dress, before finally slipping beneath the quilt. The boy curled into her side instantly, sighing in relief as though some empty space inside him had finally been filled. Her tears came silently in the dark. They rolled down her cheeks, soaking into the pillow. But they weren't only tears of grief. For the first time since the station, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel abandoned. The boy's breathing evened out, and she listened to it until sleep carried her away. When morning came, the prairie sun poured through the thin curtains, golden unforgiving. She woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee. The boy was already gone, his boots pattering down the stairs. She sat up, smoothing her tangled hair, staring at the dress she still wore. It was ruined, a relic of a promise broken before it began. She rose, folded the veil carefully, and opened her suitcase. It was filled with the few belongings she had brought, a faded shawl, a comb, a Bible, and a second dress, plain and blue. She changed into it quickly, folding the white gown away as though burying it. Downstairs, she found the rancher already at the table, his hat set aside, the boy chattering excitedly beside him as he shoveled eggs into his mouth. The rancher looked up when she entered, his gaze lingering a moment before he spoke. "Coffee's hot. There's bread, eggs." She sat gingerly, her hands folded in her lap. The boy grinned at her, crumbs on his cheek. "Mama, Papa makes the best eggs." Her heart stuttered again at the word. She glanced at the rancher, who shifted uncomfortably under her eyes. He said nothing, just sipped his coffee. After breakfast, the boy ran outside, eager to chase the dogs and the chickens. Silence settled again between her and the man. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I don't know your story. Don't need to, unless you want to tell it. But if you've nowhere to go, you're welcome to stay a while. Work here if you wish. I could use the help." She blinked, startled by his generosity. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were left standing at that station like you were worth nothing. And my boy, he sees something in you I can't take from him." Her chest tightened, and she lowered her gaze. "I was promised a husband. In letters. He never came." The shame spilled out before she could stop it. The rancher nodded slowly, not judging, not pitying. "Then maybe it's better he didn't. A man who makes promises like that and breaks them ain't a man worth having." The truth of it settled deep in her bones. She met his eyes then, and for the first time, she felt no mockery, no cruelty, no dismissal. Just steady, quiet understanding. Days stretched into weeks. She began to move about the house, sweeping, mending, cooking small meals when she could. The boy followed her everywhere, his laughter ringing through the halls that had long been quiet. At first, she felt like a shadow drifting in borrowed spaces, but slowly, her hands began to fit the rhythm of the ranch. She carried water, hung laundry in the prairie wind, planted small herbs in the garden out back. The rancher watched silently, never pushing, never asking more than she could give. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't name, half wonder, half hesitation, as if he too didn't understand what path they were on. One evening, after supper, the boy climbed into her lap with a book. "Read to me, Mama," he begged, and she did. Her voice was soft, carrying words she had learned by candlelight as a girl. The boy leaned against her, his lashes fluttering as sleep crept in. When she glanced up, she found the rancher leaning in the doorway, arms folded, watching with something unguarded in his eyes. She felt her heart move then, a small, unsteady shift. But there were nights she still cried, remembering the station, the weight of abandonment pressing down. There were mornings she feared she was nothing more than a burden, that one day the kindness would end and she'd be cast out again. She carried her brokenness carefully, afraid it might spill and ruin the fragile peace she had found. Yet every time the boy slipped his hand into hers, every time the rancher quietly set another plate at the table without a word, every time the prairie wind lifted her hair as she worked in the yard and she heard laughter behind her instead of silence, something inside her healed. Slowly, painfully, but surely. The white gown remained folded at the bottom of her suitcase, untouched. A relic of a past that had died the moment she stepped off that train. She no longer needed it. She was finding a new place, a new name, perhaps even a new life. And though she didn't dare speak it aloud, sometimes at night when the boy slept beside her, she let herself whisper a single word into the dark, tasting the strangeness and sweetness of it, home. The days stretched long beneath the wide sky, each one stitched together with chores, laughter, and silences that carried meaning. She rose before the sun most mornings, the same way she had when she lived in her parents' house, but this time there was no voice scolding her, no one pushing her toward a fate she did not want. Instead, the sound of roosters and the creak of the ranch stirring to life greeted her. The boy would tumble down the stairs still rubbing sleep from his eyes, calling for her before he even thought to wash his face. She would laugh softly, tie an apron around her waist, and fix bread and eggs while he clung to her skirt like he feared she might vanish if he let go too long. The rancher, always up early, would be outside tending the horses. When he came in for breakfast, he never said much, just tipped his hat, washed his hands, and sat at the table. Yet his silence no longer felt heavy to her. She had learned to read the quiet in him, the steady patience, the unspoken gratitude when he saw the meal already laid out, the faint softening in his eyes when the boy chattered endlessly to her. She found herself humming sometimes as she worked, melodies she thought she had forgotten. The boy would join in, his small voice warbling with childish joy, and Though the rancher never sang, she sometimes caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, as if he almost wanted to. But the prairie was not all gentleness. There were days when storms rolled in with a fury, the sky split with lightning and the wind howling against the house. On one such night, she clutched the boy close while thunder rattled the windows. He buried his face in her neck, trembling. She whispered prayers she hadn't spoken in years, her hand stroking his hair until his breathing steadied. When the rancher came in dripping wet from securing the barn, she saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the strain of keeping everything together. Without thinking, she rose and placed a towel in his hands, her fingers brushing his rough skin. He blinked at her, startled by the gesture, and for a moment neither moved. Then he nodded once, his gratitude silent but clear. Weeks turned to months. The seasons shifted, the grass grew tall and gold, and the boy seemed to bloom in her presence. His laughter echoed across the fields, his small boots pounding in the dirt as he chased chickens, dogs, and dreams. He began calling her, Mama, without hesitation now, the word rolling off his tongue as naturally as breathing. Each time it pierced her heart, not with pain, but with something achingly sweet. Still, there were shadows that lingered. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand at the window, staring across the endless dark plains, and remember the station. The humiliation of waiting, the sting of betrayal, the way people turned their faces away as if her sorrow made them uncomfortable. Those memories clung to her like burrs, reminding her that she had been unwanted, discarded. She would touch the folded white dress at the bottom of her suitcase, her fingers tracing the lace like a scar, and wonder if she would ever fully escape that moment. The rancher noticed, though she never spoke of it. One evening, when the boy had gone to bed, he found her sitting on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The stars glittered above, cold and bright. He sat beside her, silent as always, until finally he said, "You still see it, don't you?" That station. Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, but the truth hung heavy in the air. "It doesn't go away," she whispered. That feeling, of being left, of being nothing. His jaw tightened, and for a long while he didn't answer. Then he said, "You're not nothing. My boy, he laughs again because of you. That's not nothing." Her eyes burned, tears threatening, but she held them back. She looked at him, really looked, and realized his words weren't given lightly. This was a man who didn't dress truths in pretty language. When he said something, it was carved from the marrow of who he was. After that night, something shifted between them. It was subtle, unspoken, but she felt it in the way he looked at her a moment longer than before, in the way his hand brushed hers when passing a plate, in the way the silences between them grew warmer, less lonely. But the world beyond their little home was not blind. Neighbors began to whisper. A widow from a nearby homestead came calling, pretending kindness while letting sharp curiosity slip through her words. "Still wearing that ringless hand, dear. Folks are saying you were left at the altar. Shame, really." The woman's eyes slid toward the rancher, who was fixing a fence nearby. A woman alone under a man's roof, people will talk. The bride flushed crimson, her shame rising like bile. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after the boy had gone to bed, her hands trembling around a cup of tea. They think I've trapped myself here, clinging where I don't belong." The rancher leaned against the counter. His arms crossed. His face was hard, unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Let them talk. Their words don't put food on our table or keep my boy warm at night." She shook her head, tears pricking. "But I don't want him, your son, to grow up hearing whispers. I don't want him to be mocked because of me." He pushed away from the counter, his boots heavy against the floor as he moved closer. When he stopped in front of her, his shadow fell across the table. "Do you want to leave?" The quest away from the counter, his boots heavy against the floor as he moved closer. When he stopped in front of her, his shadow fell across the table. "Do you want to leave?" The question slammed into her chest. She looked up at him, startled. His eyes bore into hers, steady, unflinching. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Did she want to leave? To return where? To what? There was no home waiting for her, no family who would welcome her back without shame. And even if there was, could she walk away from the boy who had called her, Mama, with such conviction? No, she whispered, the word breaking free like a confession. I don't want to leave. Something passed through his eyes then, something fierce and unguarded. He nodded once and stepped back, as though the answer was enough. But she knew, in that moment, that he had been as afraid as she was. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work. Harvest came, demanding sweat and labor. She rose early to cook for the ranch hands, her hands flour-dusted, her hair tied back beneath the prairie sun. The rancher worked long hours, his body bent to the land, and sometimes she caught herself watching him, the strength in his movements, the quiet endurance. She wondered what it would be like to reach for him, to let herself believe she could be wanted again. One afternoon, the boy came running across the yard, clutching a wildflower in his grubby hand. "Mama, Mama," he cried, thrusting it toward her. She took it, smiling through sudden tears, and hugged him tight. Over his small shoulder, she saw the rancher watching from the fence line, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on the flower in her hand. The loneliness that had once wrapped itself around her began to loosen. It was replaced by something fragile but growing, a sense of belonging, of threads weaving her into the fabric of this home. She still feared it could unravel, still feared waking one day to find herself abandoned again. But each time the boy called for her, each time the rancher's gaze steadied hers across the table, she began to believe more in the possibility of staying. The white gown in her suitcase remained untouched. Sometimes she thought she should burn it, watch the lace and fabric vanish in smoke, but something held her back. Perhaps she kept it as a reminder of who she had been, of the pain she had survived. Or perhaps she kept it because one day she hoped the word, bride, could mean something different, something not tied to betrayal and humiliation but to love and choice. Until then, she folded it carefully and shut the suitcase tight. She had other things now, dinners to cook, stories to read, a boy to tuck into bed, and a man whose quiet presence had become the anchor she hadn't known she needed. The prairie stretched on, endless and wide, but for the first time in her life, she did not feel lost in it. She felt, in ways small and growing, found. The prairie wind was restless that evening, brushing across the tall grass as if the land itself carried secrets. She stood by the window, watching the horizon soften into dusk, the sky painted in strokes of violet and copper. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, the threads worn but warm, a comfort she had grown used to reaching for when her thoughts became too heavy. Behind her, the house hummed with life, the soft clatter of dishes, the boy's laughter from upstairs, the deep voice of the rancher telling him to wash up before supper. It had been nearly a year since she stepped off that train, abandoned and alone. A year since the boy had pointed at her through his tears and said, "That's my mama." In those first trembling moments, she had believed it was nothing more than a child's wish, a fragile hope born from loneliness. But now, standing in the home that had taken her in, she realized it had been a truth spoken before any of them knew it. The boy had flourished under her care. He ran through the fields with the dogs, his cheeks brown from the sun, his laughter strong enough to reach the far fence line. He slept deeply at night, no longer waking in tears, no longer whispering prayers for the mother he had lost. He had found one again, though not the woman who had given him life, but the one who had given him back his childhood. And the rancher, how much had shifted in him too. He was still a man of few words, steady and stoic, but she had learned to see what lay behind the silence. His kindness was not loud, but it was constant, in the way he always made sure the firewood was stacked high, in the way he left an extra blanket folded at the end of her bed on the coldest nights, in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She had once mistaken silence for distance, but now she knew it was his way of holding space for her to choose. Yet even as her heart had learned to settle here, to beat with something like peace, shadows had not entirely lifted. Whispers still drifted through town, spoken behind hands and half-closed doors. A woman left at a station, taken in by a rancher without a ring on her finger, it was gossip too sweet for people to resist. Sometimes when she went to town with the boy, she felt the stares like pins against her skin. But each time, the boy's small hand found hers, and the rancher's solid presence walked beside her, and the whispers seemed to lose their sharpness. One evening, the rancher came in later than usual, his boots heavy with dust. She had stayed up waiting, a pot of stew kept warm on the stove. He set his hat down and rubbed the back of his neck, weary. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her as though searching for words. Then, finally, he said, "I hear things in town. Folks talking. They don't mean you no kindness." Her chest tightened, her spoon stilled in her hand. "I know," she whispered. "I hear it too." His gaze was steady, quiet fire in his eyes. Do you want me to tell them you're not mine? That you'll be leaving? The question struck her like a blow. She dropped her eyes, afraid of what he might see in them. Is that what you want? She asked softly. The silence stretched, thick and trembling, until he finally spoke. No. His voice was low, certain, carrying more weight than any declaration she had ever heard. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her as he reached for her hand. I don't want you to leave. Neither does the boy. But I won't hold you here if your heart don't want it. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She looked up at him, at the man who had taken her in when she was broken, who had never once asked for more than she could give, who had given her and the boy a place to heal. This is where my heart is, she whispered, her voice trembling but true. His hand tightened around hers, rough and warm. For the first time, his guard slipped fully, and she saw the depth of what he had carried, loneliness, grief, and the quiet hope that had begun to grow since she had come. That night, the boy padded down the stairs in his nightshirt, sleepy-eyed and confused. Mama, Papa, why are you still up? She smiled through her tears, kneeling to gather him in her arms. Just talking, love, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his hair. The boy yawned and clung to her neck, content. The rancher's eyes softened at the sight, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that they were already bound, even without rings or papers. But the rancher was not a man to leave things unspoken for long. A week later, he rose earlier than usual and rode into town alone. When he returned, his face was set with determination, his jaw firm. That evening, after supper, he called her and the boy to the porch. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and wild, the sky burning with the last light of day. He cleared his throat, nerves flickering beneath his calm. I don't have fancy words, he said. And I can't give you a life without hardship. But I can give you a name that's yours, not borrowed. I can give you a home that's not temporary. I can give you a husband, and the boy a mother, in the way that leaves no room for whispers. Her breath caught. For a moment, she could only stare, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her chest. The boy grinned wide, bouncing on his heels. Mama, say yes. Please say yes. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to find words. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, stronger, yes. The rancher let out a breath he had been holding for months, maybe years. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her and the boy together, holding them as though he would never let go. And in that embrace, she felt the weight of all the brokenness she had carried slip away, replaced by something stronger, steadier, love built not from promises on paper, but from choice and quiet devotion. The wedding was small, held beneath the cottonwood tree that shaded the ranch. The boy stood proudly between them, clutching both their hands, his smile wide enough to split the sky. Neighbors came, some with gossip still on their tongues, but the sight of the three of them together, bound by something undeniable, silenced even the sharpest whispers. The rancher's vows were simple, plain-spoken, but they held more power than any letter could. Her vows trembled with emotion, but they carried the truth of everything she had found here. When it was done, the boy threw his arms around her waist and shouted, "Now you're my mama forever." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but for her, it was no joke. It was the truest thing ever spoken. Life did not grow easier after that, it was still filled with long days, hard work, and the weight of survival on the land. But now the burdens were shared. She moved through the house not as a guest but as its keeper, her touch softening its corners, her laughter brightening its rooms. The boy thrived, and the rancher, though still quiet, carried himself with a lightness she had never seen before. Sometimes she would take the white gown from the suitcase, the one she had once thought a symbol of her worthlessness, and she would unfold it carefully. She no longer saw failure in its lace. She saw a path that had led her here, to this ranch, this man, this child. She folded it again, placing it back not as a wound but as a relic, a piece of her story she no longer feared. Years later, when the boy had grown taller, when his boots no longer clattered so small across the floor, she would sit on that same porch with the rancher at her side. The prairie would stretch endless before them, the sun dipping low, the wind carrying the scent of grass and earth. She would lean into his shoulder, his arm wrapped steady around her, and she would know without question that she had been found, chosen, loved. And when she remembered the train station, the veil crushed in her trembling hands, the tears that had stained her cheeks, she would think not of abandonment but of beginnings. For if no one had come for her that day, it was because someone else was waiting. A boy with a brave little heart, a man with steady hands, and a home that had been empty until she stepped into it. The station had been the end of one life, but the ranch was the beginning of another. She had not been left behind. She had been led here, to love, to family, to a place where she was no longer invisible, no longer unwanted. She was his wife. She was the boy's mother. She was home.